or have you been concerting?
Oh, no, 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 no. I got out of the business entirely. I'd had
Left
enough.
music?
Yeah, because of the relationship I have with the business. And I feel let down a lot.
At 62 years old, Julian Lennon broke decades of silence with just a few words, and those words shook the world. For so long, fans worshipped the legend of John Lennon, the voice of peace, the dreamer, the man who told the world to imagine love and harmony. But behind that perfect image was a boy who lived a very different truth. While the world sang along to his father's songs, Julian was left trying to understand why the man behind the music had walked away. For years, he carried that pain quietly, trapped between fame and fatherhood, legacy and loss. To the public, John Lennon was a hero. To Julian, he was a stranger, a name that opened every door and yet closed the one that mattered most. And when Julian finally spoke, his words exposed the side of the Lennon story no one was ready to hear. This isn't just another story about fame or fortune. It's a story about a son's search for belonging, about what happens when the world adores the man who broke your heart. Stay until the end, because what Julian revealed will change the way you see the Lennon legacy forever. From the outside, Julian Lennon's childhood looked like a dream. He was the son of one of the most famous men on the planet, a Beatle. Cameras flashed, fans screamed, and the world assumed his life was coated in gold. But behind the walls of the Lennon home, the story was far less glamorous. Happiness was rare, and stability was almost non-existent. The day John Lennon walked out wasn't just the day a marriage ended. It was the day a family shattered. Julian's mother, Cynthia, was left to pick up the pieces. She worked tirelessly to give her son some sense of normal life, selling treasured belongings just to keep food on the table. Fame didn't pay their bills. There were no chauffeurs or mansions, just a mother doing everything she could to hold their world together. While people imagined luxury, the reality was cold apartments and secondhand clothes. For Julian, the name Lennon became both a blessing and a burden. It opened doors, but it also carried expectations too heavy for a child to bear. Strangers would smile and call him lucky, but they didn't see the loneliness behind his smile. At school, other kids taunted him, thinking he had everything, when in truth, he had already lost the one thing he wanted most: a father. Even as a boy, Julian learned that fame could give you anything except the things that truly matter. His father's songs talked about peace and love, but at home, there was only distance and silence. And that silence grew louder with every passing year. But what hurt most wasn't just his father's absence. It was watching the world celebrate the man he could never reach. As Julian grew older, the distance between the myth and the man became impossible to ignore. The world worshipped John Lennon, a global symbol of peace, love, and unity. His voice filled stadiums, his words inspired millions, and his message became a movement. Yet to the boy watching from the sidelines, that message rang hollow. The man who told the world to imagine all the people living life in peace couldn't find peace in his own home. At school, Julian was treated like a walking contradiction. Teachers assumed he was privileged, untouchable, the son of a rock god. But classmates saw him as an easy target. They mocked him, hit him, and reminded him daily that fame didn't mean protection. He learned early that admiration from strangers doesn't heal the wounds left by family. While fans lined up for autographs, Julian lined up for cafeteria meals, trying to hide the last name that made him feel more isolated than proud. His mother was his only refuge. Cynthia's strength became the armor that shielded him from the chaos surrounding their name. She rarely spoke ill of John, even when she had every reason to. Instead, she focused on giving Julian a childhood that still had warmth, even when the world around them had gone cold. But deep down, Julian couldn't escape the growing shadow of his father's fame. Every radio broadcast, every magazine cover, every poster with his father's face reminded him of what he didn't have: a relationship. To the world, John Lennon was a visionary. To Julian, he was a ghost that fame kept alive. And as the years passed, that ghost only grew larger, casting a shadow over every part of his identity. The truth was simple but painful. His father had built a legacy that the world adored, but it came at the cost of a son who felt forgotten. And soon, that sense of rejection would only deepen when a new chapter in the Lennon story began, one that would change everything for Julian. When Julian was still trying to make sense of his father's absence, another child entered the picture: John Lennon. To the public, it was a beautiful new beginning. John had found love again, remarried Yoko Ono, and was now embracing fatherhood with open arms. Magazine covers celebrated it as redemption, the story of a man reborn. But to Julian, it felt like watching his father become everything he'd needed, just for someone else. Photos flooded the media, John holding Sean, smiling ear to ear, calling himself a house husband. Fans called it touching. Julian called it confusing. The man who'd once walked out on him was now being praised for his tenderness. Every headline about John's devotion to Sean cut a little deeper because it painted a picture of the father he never got to have. It wasn't Sean's fault, of course. He was just a child, innocent in all of it. But the world's constant comparisons made it impossible for Julian to escape the feeling of being replaced. He wasn't the son people wanted to talk about anymore. He was the reminder of a chapter John wanted to forget. Still, Julian tried to hold on to some piece of his father. A conversation here, a letter there. The rare moment when John would call and try to make things right. But those moments never lasted. They were like echoes that faded as quickly as they appeared. Every time Julian thought the distance might finally close, it widened again. The love that had once been uncertain now felt completely out of reach. Julian had spent his entire life searching for the father behind the legend, but all he ever found were stories, photographs, and songs that belonged to everyone but him. And then, just when there was a faint chance for reconciliation, when the door to understanding seemed to open, tragedy struck. One night changed everything, and the world would never look at the Lennon name the same way again. It was an ordinary December night when the world stopped. News broke that John Lennon had been killed outside his New York apartment. Within minutes, headlines spread across the globe. The voice of a generation was gone. Crowds gathered outside the Dakota, lighting candles and singing his songs through tears. The world mourned a legend, but Julian Lennon wasn't mourning a legend. He was mourning a father he never truly knew. He was still young, living far from the chaos, separated not only by distance but by years of silence. The last time they spoke, John had sounded different, softer, almost hopeful. For the first time in years, Julian had felt a flicker of connection, a hint that maybe things could finally change. And then, in a single night, that hope was gone forever. There was no funeral for him to attend, no proper goodbye. Yoko Ono announced there would be no public ceremony, no closure for the millions who adored him, and none for the son still waiting to be seen. Julian was left alone with his thoughts, watching the world worship a man who, in his reality, had always been distant. As reporters turned John's death into a global tragedy, Julian's grief stayed private. It wasn't the grief of fans. It was the pain of unfinished conversations and unspoken forgiveness. He wasn't just mourning a death. He was mourning the chance to finally tell his father everything he'd held inside for so long. And now, those words would never be heard. In that moment, Julian realized that fame could build monuments that touched millions, but it could never rebuild what was broken at home. And when the will was finally read, that truth would cut deeper than ever before. When the will was finally read, the truth was impossible to ignore. John Lennon had left nearly everything: the estate, the royalties, the music rights, to Yoko Ono and his younger son Sean. Julian's name was barely mentioned. After decades of waiting for acknowledgement, all he received was proof of what he'd always feared, that he had been written out of his father's story. To outsiders, it looked like just another inheritance dispute. But for Julian, it was something much deeper. It wasn't about money. It was about dignity, about finally being recognized as his father's son, not just by blood, but by memory. The legal fight that followed stretched for years, consuming time, energy, and emotion. Headlines painted him as greedy, as if he was after wealth, when all he wanted was fairness. Behind closed doors, the battle was exhausting. Lawyers, paperwork, tense negotiations. Every meeting was a reminder that his connection to his father now existed in signatures and contracts. Rumors claimed the settlement reached into the millions, but Julian never confirmed it. What he did share, however, spoke volumes. With some of the settlement, he began buying back his father's old possessions: letters, memorabilia, and personal items that had been sold off to strangers. It was a painful irony, spending the money he fought for to reclaim the pieces of a father he never truly had. But in a way, it gave him something money couldn't buy: closure. Those items weren't trophies. They were fragments of a relationship that had never been whole. By holding them, Julian wasn't trying to own his father's legacy. He was simply trying to understand it. Still, the wounds ran deep. Every contracting courtroom echoed the same truth, that the Lennon name, while powerful, came with a price. And for years, that cost would define his relationship with Yoko Ono, the woman who controlled everything his father left behind. But what began as resentment would eventually turn into something else. Not forgiveness, but a fragile kind of peace. For years, Yoko Ono was the wall Julian couldn't climb. She controlled everything tied to John Lennon's legacy, the music, the estate, the public image. And for Julian, she became the symbol of everything that kept him at a distance. He blamed her for the silence, for the separation, for the cold divide between father and son. Every public event, every interaction felt tense, polite, and painfully forced. They rarely spoke, and when they did, the conversations were short and strained. Julian kept his composure, but underneath it all was decades of resentment. To him, Yoko wasn't a stepmother. She was a reminder of everything he'd lost. The power imbalance was impossible to ignore. She was the gatekeeper of his father's memory, and he was still the outsider trying to find his place in it. But over time, anger started to lose its strength. Years of bitterness had left him tired, and holding on to hate began to feel heavier than the pain itself. Little by little, moments of civility began to replace tension. A shared event here, a brief exchange there. Not affection, but understanding. For Julian, it wasn't about making peace with Yoko. It was about making peace with himself. He realized that the fight was no longer serving him. The past couldn't be rewritten, and the pain couldn't be undone. What he could control, however, was how much of it he carried forward. By choosing not to hate, Julian wasn't excusing the past. He was freeing himself from it. And that decision opened the door to something unexpected. Not reconciliation with Yoko, but a bond that would eventually bring a sense of healing he never thought he'd find. That bond came from the one person who truly understood his pain, his brother, John Lennon. For most of their lives, Julian and John Lennon lived on opposite sides of the same story. The media loved to pit them against each other, the forgotten son versus the chosen one. But the truth was far quieter. There was no rivalry, no resentment, just two brothers trying to make sense of a legacy neither of them asked for. In the early years, distance kept them apart. Julian carried the pain of absence, while Sean grew up under the glow of his father's later years. Their worlds couldn't have been more different. Yet time has a way of softening what anger once hardened. When they finally began to reconnect, it wasn't through fame or inheritance. It was through empathy. Both knew what it meant to live in the shadow of John Lennon. That understanding soon became respect. Julian saw in Sean the same kindness and curiosity he once had as a boy. Sean saw in Julian the strength it took to survive what he never had to endure. One of their most meaningful moments came when they attended the Get Back premiere together, walking side by side into the past that had defined them both. For Julian, it wasn't just another event. It was a quiet act of courage, a step toward peace. Through that bond, Julian finally found what he'd been missing all along: connection without bitterness, family without pain. And that newfound peace gave him the strength to take the next step, to finally own his story and redefine what the Lennon name meant to him. After years of pain, distance, and silence, Julian Lennon finally began to reclaim his life on his own terms. He stopped chasing his father's shadow and started building something that was entirely his. Music was still in his blood, but this time it wasn't about living up to a legend. It was about finding his own voice. His later work, especially the album Jude, became a reflection of everything he'd endured and everything he'd learned. The title itself, inspired by Hey Jude, the song Paul McCartney wrote for him as a child, carried a deeper meaning now. It wasn't a reminder of what he'd lost. It was a symbol of how far he'd come. Julian poured himself into more than just music. Photography, writing, environmental causes. He found peace in creativity and purpose in helping others. For the first time, his name wasn't tied to his father's image or legacy. It stood on its own. He no longer tried to fit into the story the world had written for him. Instead, he began writing his own. In interviews, Julian has been open about his boundaries. He's said that he often learns about major Beatles projects the same way the public does, through the news. But rather than bitterness, there's acceptance in his voice. He no longer needs to be part of the inner circle to find meaning in his connection to John. He honors his father's memory in his own quiet way, through art, compassion, and authenticity. Breaking free from the Lennon name wasn't about rejecting it, it was about redefining it. Julian's journey became proof that healing doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it simply means learning to live without resentment, to let the past rest without letting it rule you. And in doing so, Julian Lennon finally did what his father always sang about. He found peace. Julian Lennon's story isn't a perfect one. It was never meant to be. It's not about revenge or wealth or rewriting history. It's about survival. It's about learning that closure doesn't always come wrapped in forgiveness, and that peace sometimes means letting go of the answers you'll never get. For most of his life, Julian carried the weight of a name that wasn't truly his to bear. He endured the loneliness, the comparisons, and the silence, all while the world adored the man who left him behind. But through it all, he found his own rhythm, his own purpose, and his own kind of love. He never needed to be another John Lennon. He just needed to be Julian, the boy who turned pain into art, distance into perspective, and bitterness into balance. His journey reminds us that even when life doesn't give you the closure you hoped for, you still have the power to create your own peace, because healing isn't about forgetting the past. It's about finally being able to look back without breaking. So if this story moved you, if it made you see the Lennon legacy in a new light, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories like this one. We uncover the real lives behind the legends, the pain, the redemption, and the humanity that fame never shows. Because behind every headline, there's always a story that deserves to be heard.